Hi, everyone. So I am super excited to be here for a few reasons. First of all, I did the math, it's been 2 years and 1 week since I stood in person in front of an audience and gave a talk. That was in LA at Carbon Positive, and the day we all left the conference and flew out, California went into emergency, whatever it was called, because of the pandemic. So pretty crazy to be here. This is also my first time in Michigan. And I've been working with the 2030 districts, including the Grand Rapids 2030 district in the city for almost a decade now. And this is my first time meeting all of these folks. And finally, my husband was born and raised in Grand Rapids. And I've never gotten to see his city. So thank you so much for having me and for showing me your beautiful city. Okay, and now I have to figure out how to use this. Can someone help me figure out how to use a clicker? Green button. Oh, the big green button. Who'd have thought? Okay. All right. So as Sherry said, what I'm really going to focus this talk on is how we are going to decarbonize the building sector, including what we're already doing. But before I do that, I do have to spend a bit of time talking about why we're here. And as Sherry mentioned, and some of this can be, not as much fun to talk about, but there's a reason why we're doing this. So with the climate emergency, timing is everything. As most of you are probably aware, at COP21, the Paris Agreement was signed, where most countries in the world agreed to try to keep our global warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, with aiming for about 1.5 degrees C, and that 2 degrees threshold is pretty crucial. If we pass that line, we enter negative feedback loops where we are no longer able to get climate change back under control, and so that's why there's such a focus around that. And NASA runs this kind of climate change mission control where they keep track of our current situation, and as you can see, we're currently at about 1.18. And so getting up onto that 1.5 pretty quickly here. And the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that puts together all of the climate science research globally and puts out reports, just put out a report, I believe it was last week. And this is one of the quotes that stuck with me. And I mean, this, we all know this, but it's emphasized. We have a really, really short window of time to achieve these targets, or else we might cross that threshold and run out of time. So there's this pretty cool and also kind of alarming thing called the climate clock. I'm not sure if any of you have seen this. This is an image of it from Glasgow at COP26, and it's a thing that kind of travels around the world and comes to big events. And it has two parts. First, it tells us how many years we have left until we're meeting that 1.5 degree C deadline. And then the second part, the blue part, we'll talk about in a second. But as you can see at Glasgow, we had a little under 7 years left at current global emission rates to stay below 1.5 degrees C. So, urgent. And what does this mean in terms of our timeline and in terms of the carbon budget? So the IPCC has told us that we can spend, if you will, about 340 to 400 gigatons more of carbon globally before we cross that 1.5 degree C threshold. And for at least a decade now, the talk has been about achieving zero carbon globally by 2050 in order to stay within that budget. But we emit about 40 gigatons a year, at least in 2020, that's what we were doing, and unfortunately the pandemic didn't actually change our emissions very much, so we're still at about that. So you can see pretty easily that if we just do a linear trajectory down from 2020 to 2050, we're blowing way past our carbon budget. So zero by 2050 is unfortunately not going to do it anymore. So instead, we can see that if we achieve about a 50 to 65% reduction in emissions globally, not just building sector, by 2030, and then zero emissions by 2040, we're hitting that budget right on. So moving forward, 2040 is our 0 year. That's our climate deadline. That's what all of our efforts have to be focused on. But I said the clock has two parts, right? It has the scary part and it has the positive part. They call this the lifeline, and that's our renewable energy generation. That's, all of our clean electricity that can power our buildings, power our infrastructure, power our manufacturing, power our transportation. Unfortunately, right now, we're only at about 12% of our energy demand being met by renewables. So this is something that we're working on locally, we're working on globally, but it has pretty big implications. One of the most exciting things, though, is that the prices of energy are changing really dramatically. So this chart here is going to show the levelized cost of energy, kind of a nerdy term, but basically it's the cost to produce electricity all the way from building a power plant, operating costs, procuring that energy, et cetera. And you can see all these lines going from 2009 to 2019, and quickly I'm just going to pop down the list. We see gas is our most expensive, down to nuclear, solar thermal, coal, geothermal, other kind of gas, not quite sure what the difference is, to be honest. But the salient part, onshore wind and solar photovoltaic. Those are the cheapest sources of electricity today globally. They're hovering at about $40 per megawatt hour. So producing more renewable energy is quickly becoming significantly more attainable. And we can see this if we look at how much world wind and solar electricity generation has just dramatically increased over the last couple of decades, this big exponential growth. This is true across the world, it's true in the US as well, and we're reaching a point where we're doubling the production of solar and wind energy somewhere between every 2 and 4 years. So it's quite literally expanding exponentially. So this, as the climate clock says, is our lifeline, and it's a critical part of what we're doing. And briefly, because we've all been faced with the harsh reality of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine right now, I want to talk about that through the lens of energy. And I want to be really clear before I show this that I'm not saying that what we are doing right here in the room in Grand Rapids is going to somehow magically stop Russia from being at war with Ukraine. But it is a microcosmic example of how the climate crisis really is an energy crisis, really is a national security crisis, and this applies to all of us across the world. So we have this situation in Russia right now where 45% of their federal budget is from exporting oil and gas. And the implication of this is that inadvertently, all of the countries that are buying their oil and gas are funding the war. So the obvious response from the US as well as from Europe, even though in the US we barely consume any Russian oil, is to say, okay, we need to stop funding that war. Unfortunately, especially in Europe, they are so dependent on Russia's oil and gas that they are at risk of not being able to heat the homes of their citizens, of not being able to drive their cars. So they're in this really, really upsetting catch-22. And the reality and the realization is that if they had much more energy independence, they wouldn't maybe be in this situation. Now, there are two potential responses to this, and I know that this is a long quote. I apologize for that, but I think it's really important. And I'm sure you have all been part of this conversation, or at least heard about it in the last couple of weeks. We can either ramp up oil and gas production somewhere else to meet that demand, make sure people aren't freezing to death and not being able to drive their cars, and I think that that's a worthy goal for all of us to have, or we can dramatically increase our production and generation of renewable energy so that we have distributed energy resources that offer energy democracy and independence for nationally. And this is a quote from my boss, Ed Mesria. He just put out an article on this that demonstrating the fact that the reality is that if we do depend on oil and gas production to try to make up for the demand in Europe of Russian oil, and again, remember that this is a microcosmic example that could be happening anywhere to any of us globally if the situation were different. Not only are we not going to have an impact in the immediate term, we can't just immediately start heating all the homes and buildings, but then we'd be putting in legacy infrastructure that's going to blow way past our 2040 climate deadline in terms of the emissions. And so we have a pretty important choice to make right now. And that's it. I don't want to spend more time talking about Russia and Ukraine because, again, little impact that we all can have in terms of decarbonizing our buildings in Grand Rapids or in the US, but a reminder that this is bigger than just the climate, not that the climate isn't big enough in and of itself. Okay, So now the good part. What are we doing? What are our actions that we can take? What is the progress that has been made? What's the framework that is in place for achieving zero carbon? So when we're talking about decarbonizing the building sector, we're really talking about three different segments of the building sector, if you will. We have new buildings, we have existing buildings, and in this case, I mean the operations of our existing buildings. So what does it take to power our lights and to, have these computers on and to have the heaters running? And then, like Sherry mentioned, we have embodied carbon, and that is arguably the hardest part to tackle. And embodied carbon is everything that went into the building before it was operated. So it's material extraction to, I don't know if these are actual marble. That would be pretty cool. But marble material extraction, probably it's actually concrete and steel. It's transportation to manufacturing plants. It's transportation from manufacturing to site. It's all the carbon embodied or embedded in the building. And that is not insignificant, and I will talk about that a little bit more. So when we're talking about the building sector, what's our impact globally? As from an annual snapshot perspective, building operations are responsible for about 28% of total global building emissions, so a huge chunk. And then if you add in that embodied carbon piece, building materials and construction, that's another 11%. And so you can see, without even having to see the other sectors' percentages, that buildings are the biggest emitter of carbon globally. So while that's a problem, the flip side is that means we are all part of the solution. We have an opportunity to dramatically transform the course of our emissions trajectory and our climate targets. And we also have another opportunity and another potential issue here. We are expected to double the global building stock by 2060. And what that means is essentially building an entire New York City, all 5 boroughs, once a month for the foreseeable future. And you can imagine the implications of that. We can either bring these buildings in at zero carbon, low embodied carbon if possible, and minimize our impact, but not, negate the impact of existing buildings, or we can make the problem dramatically worse. On the flip side, about 2/3 of the buildings that are currently standing are still going to exist by our climate deadline in 2040. And so that means that if we don't touch those buildings, if we leave them operating as is, we also will not have solved this problem. We're still going to be emitting a lot of carbon. So we have to address new buildings and existing buildings. And I'll talk about how that impacts a place like Grand Rapids a little bit more. But first, I'm going to do the hard part and talk about embodied carbon. And I wanted to center it because it really does often get ignored and put to the end of the conversation. That being said, the bulk of this talk is about operational carbon, and I really want to focus on the details. So I'm going to go over the framework for reducing and achieving zero embodied carbon, but just know that this is barely touching the surface. It's still largely a new field. There's a large amount of research coming out on a daily basis, but it's a challenge from a policy perspective, from a manufacturing perspective, and we need a lot of smart people trying to figure out how we're going to deal with this. So just to make it a little bit more clear, and you don't really have to pay too much attention to the kind of nitty-gritty of this chart, but what this chart is really showing is the balance of embodied to operational carbon of that new construction, that doubling of the global building stock. And if you draw a line in the sand at our climate target of 2040, with no interventions, if we're just building our buildings as business as usual, about 57% of the total emissions from that new building stock will be embodied carbon. So there's no arguing that it is an absolutely critical piece of the puzzle that we have to address. And the framework for addressing it is in some ways pretty simple, and I'm going to say this multiple times. Some of what we have to do from a conceptual level is very simple. Implementing it is incredibly challenging, and I don't want you all to think I don't understand that part. But from a framework perspective, we have to do 3 things. We have to reuse as much as we can, reduce, and then sequester, and I'll talk about that a little bit. So for embodied carbon in particular, because the carbon is embedded in the building in quite literal terms, the existing infrastructure that we already have in place is our biggest asset. It's our biggest bang for our buck. And so the most important thing that we can do for embodied carbon is reuse, reuse, reuse. That means not just repurposing and upgrading urban areas and in maybe underutilized buildings, but that means adapting and renovating existing spaces instead of tearing that down, and that means trying to reuse as much material as possible. And I think when we talk about construction, we don't typically think about reusing timber or brick or even concrete turned into aggregate, and that's an important piece of it. And then once we've done that, once we've reused as much as possible, decided not to add more to the embodied carbon problem, then we need to reduce the embodied carbon of what we are using as much as possible. And there are a lot of ways that this can be done. We can stop developing out as much, and instead infill and densification is going to better utilize our spaces. From a structural engineering perspective, the codes and also kind of standard practice often has us oversizing a lot of our structure and using a lot more material in a building than is strictly necessary. And this becomes a policy issue sometimes when codes don't allow us to actually right-size our structure. And then, of course, whenever possible, specifying lower or zero embodied carbon materials for the materials that you do have to use. And then finally, sequestration. I think this one, we talk about it through the lens of embodied carbon in this case, but this is really a climate solution across the board, right? We need to reduce our impact as much as possible, but we also need to start pulling carbon out of the air whenever possible and keeping it embedded in this case, our building stock. And our building stock is a huge opportunity to keep a lot of carbon embedded in it. So there's, across the board, a bunch of examples of how that's happening. Mass timber being a pretty obvious one to everyone, I think, but there's all these cool new materials coming out where they're sequestering carbon inside of concrete, and bioengineering materials made out of algae and mushrooms that grow. I mean, it's like really crazy cool stuff is going on. The problem is that at this point, not a ton of it is very scalable. So these are kind of one-off things that are happening in laboratories or fancy example building projects, and we still need to work really hard on figuring out how to scale these solutions really quickly. And like I said, barely touching the surface of embodied carbon. There are a ton of resources on this, and one that I want to highlight is a project that Architecture 2030 worked on with the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance and a firm out of Finland called Bionova, and we put together this list of, I believe it's 52 different potential embodied carbon policies that can tackle the issue all the way from like really early like zoning and planning decisions all the way down to municipal building procurement for materials. And one of my favorite parts of this resource is that we went through it not only putting in policies that already have precedence, but also what I call our dream embodied carbon policy list. And so we got to spend a month or so just imagining the possibilities for regulating embodied carbon, and it's pretty exciting when you start going into it to think about all the ways that we can tackle this beyond just procuring low embodied carbon concrete. So, barely touching the surface, but as Sherry said, and I think as the data show, this is really where we need to go next. Okay. But now the part that I'm most excited to talk about, which is operational carbon. And I think partly I'm most excited about this because there's so much progress already being made, including in Grand Rapids. And it's really rewarding to see so much success. So to talk about it, first I'm going to have us look at what an example building stock in a city might look like. And Sherry mentioned the Zero Cities project. So that was a project that 11 different municipalities across the country, including Grand Rapids, participated in. And it involved a lot of in-depth analysis of the building stocks of each of these different cities and their energy and emissions trends and projections out to 2050. And what we came up with were some kind of commonalities across the board. And one of the commonalities across the board is that if we do not intervene in our building stock, by far the majority of the emissions that we would see in 2050, noting that with Zero Cities, the target year was still 2050, so really we should be looking at 2040 now, but things change quickly. By far the majority of the emissions are going to be our existing building stock. New construction, not going to be as impactful. That doesn't mean we can ignore it though, of course, because any new construction that comes on board that is not zero carbon is just adding to the problem. And of those emissions, again, a common trend across the board is split between electricity and gas emissions, and that makes sense to most of us. For most cities, gas was about 40% of the emissions, maybe 40 to 50%. Grand Rapids is in a bit of a different situation. Here, your electricity emissions are actually much more impactful. I think you're about 63% of your building stock emissions are coming from electricity, and that has to do with what kind of fuels are powering the grid. But the point still stands that we have to address emissions from electricity and we have to address emissions from gas within the building stock. And one of the ways that our electricity emissions are changing dramatically, and this should make sense given the renewable energy pricing and growth charts that I showed, is that our grids are decarbonizing. It's happening more quickly in some places than in other places, but by pure economics alone, the trend shows that our grids will clean up. Hopefully by 2040, because that's our deadline, but it is going to happen. It's the cheapest way to generate energy. The momentum is already there. If policies aren't in place, economics alone will dictate that this will happen. When that happens, of course, with no intervention, the rest of the emissions from the building sector will be gas. So let's talk about new buildings. Let's talk about the framework for decarbonizing. So for every single building, decarbonizing will require the same three things. The first is energy efficiency. And this one I think makes a lot of sense. Most of us are really familiar with energy efficiency. We've been working on that for decades. And that simply means making sure our buildings don't consume more energy than they need. Pretty straightforward. And the way to do this, the best way to do this, is to, when a building is designed, meet the latest model energy codes. From a policy perspective, require meeting the latest model energy codes. I know that there is currently conversation as we speak going on in Michigan about adopting IECC 2021, the International Energy Conservation Code, and that would be a fantastic way, if that were to happen, to make sure that new buildings coming online are consuming as little energy as they can. Then the next step is that gas piece. And this is a challenge, but we all are aware of the big electrification movement happening across the country and globally. And so to make sure that no fossil fuels are being uncombusted on site, new construction needs to use electric equipment. There is discussion, especially in a place like Grand Rapids where the grid is powered by more dirty fuels, about if electrification makes sense from an immediate and long-term perspective. And to be honest, I think that's a really fair question. The answer, at least in my opinion, is that electric equipment at least has the potential to be carbon-free. Unfortunately, gas equipment does not really have the potential to be carbon-free. So with electrification, we're setting ourselves up for success. And then the last piece is this renewable piece. We need to make sure that if the building is as efficient as possible, if it has electric equipment, that that electricity is actually coming from a clean energy source. And that, can also be a challenge, but we need to make sure we're generating or procuring enough renewable energy to meet that demand. And what I think one of the most exciting things about this renewable energy piece is that buildings are the biggest consumer of energy across the board. So not only are we the biggest emitters, but we're also the biggest consumers. That means we have our demand, our power for demand has the power to push change really quickly. So if buildings are not only requiring their utilities to give them options for providing renewable energy, but are also generating their own renewable energy that can contribute to the transition of the grid to zero carbon, we're just speeding up this process and making it that much easier to meet our climate targets. And I mentioned the IECC 2021. There is an appendix in the IECC 2021. I know this is getting a little bit in the weeds, but there's an appendix that is optional for jurisdictions to adopt if they would like to. And this is a renewable energy appendix. And it has a really easy to follow framework that is internationally applicable for ensuring that buildings are able to generate or procure the renewable energy that they need, and ensuring that that renewable energy is supporting the grid in transitioning to zero carbon instead of simply trading renewable energy credits for really cheap. And again, a little bit in the weeds, but this framework is in place to make sure that that demand side is really being leveraged and we're really aiding that transition to zero. And I want to talk about examples of all of this as we go along to show that this is doable, this is viable. So the first example for new construction is out of Boston, and they are imminently in the process of passing this zero net carbon building zoning initiative. And a couple of reasons why I think this is critical to point to highlight. The first is that, and I know it's a little bit hard to see, but the screenshot, the underlined text on the screenshot shows all of the different kind of sections of this zoning initiative that they focused on. And there are two for renewable energy. They focused on on-site and off-site renewable energy generation. So you can see how critically important that was to them. And then there's also an embodied carbon piece. And I got to give Boston props because it is so challenging to even get to the point where you can include a robust embodied carbon policy in a package and have that be ready for imminent passage, and it is. So something to look out to. And then the other reason that I think Boston is important to call out here is that you'll notice that this is done through zoning. So when we're talking about especially new construction policies, most of us immediately think, okay, we have to change the energy code or the building code. And a lot of cities and states have found that that is incredibly challenging for various reasons. In Michigan, you are not a home rule state. And that means that in Grand Rapids, you are not allowed to be more aggressive in your building and energy code than the state dictates. So they're just immediately putting a damper on any progress in that specific sense that you want to make. And so Boston was able to get around similar barriers by saying, okay, we're just not going to do this in the energy and building code then, we're just going to do it in zoning. And in addition to that, they're regulating carbon, not energy. And that was also critical. They were not legally allowed to regulate energy in a lot of capacities, but there's no laws in place yet that say they can't regulate carbon, so they jumped right on that and they said, all right, if this is a gray area, we're going to take advantage and we're going to regulate carbon, and they've been successful. So kind of lessons learned in creative policy making and thinking here. Okay, now existing buildings. To me, this is the most exciting part, partly because of that chart with the wedge, right? 17% new construction, the rest existing buildings, and partly because this is by far the biggest challenge. There are a lot of examples of new construction policies across the board. There are very, very, very few policy precedents for existing buildings, and I'm going to talk about the few that there are. But what this tells me is that if we can solve these problems in the existing building stock, especially in small buildings, which I'll talk about, then we've solved these problems across the board. And luckily, because of the Zero Cities project, in large part to thanks to Grand Rapids was one of the most intensive and active and comprehensive participants in the Zero Cities project. We have been able, Architecture 2030, yeah, I mean, seriously, props. You all are, as someone who works across the country and internationally on this, I can say definitively that you are leaders in this. And I know people expect that from a New York City or a Seattle. You all are maybe unsung heroes, but you are leaders in this, and it is really, really impressive. And because of the Zero Cities project and because of Grand Rapids' participation in that, Architecture 2030 was able to develop this zero carbon framework. And I'm going to talk about what that framework is, but you all deserve a lot of credit for this. Yeah, I'm looking at Allison. So, very similarly to new construction, again, it's simple, right? Very similarly to new construction, decarbonizing our existing buildings will require the same three things: efficiency, electrification, and renewable energy. But unlike new construction, it's a lot more complicated to try to address an entire existing building stock with just one policy. So what this framework is largely about is figuring out how to create the right kind of policies that are going to touch all of the building subsectors, and in particular, how to do it equitably. This is really where the rubber meets the road in terms of equity, in large part because decarbonizing existing buildings is really expensive, unfortunately. It's just really expensive. And so creative approaches to policymaking are required for this to not be a burden to our low-income, in particular, communities, but honestly, for this to even be passed. These policies cannot get passed without figuring out how to address that cost. And so that's a big part of what I'm talking about here. So The first segmentation, if you will, of the building stock that we started working with during the Zero Cities project, which was a fascinating find for us, is big buildings, small buildings. And I'm going to quickly explain this chart because it looks a little weird, but then if you get it, you're like, wow. So on the bottom, the x-axis, that is the percent of building stock that big buildings represent. So what we're seeing for all of these cities is that somewhere between 1% and 4% of their building stock are big buildings. And usually that's above 10,000 or 20,000 square feet, depending. And those 1% to 4% of buildings, the y-axis is total emissions, are responsible for 40 to upwards of, what's that big green one? Upwards of 75 or 80% of total building sector emissions. So you have a very small cohort of buildings in almost every city that is responsible for, on average, about 50% of the total emissions. That is pretty obvious policy implications, I would imagine. And in Grand Rapids specifically, your big buildings, in this case, the threshold on these slides is 20,000 square feet. We also did the analysis for 10,000 square feet. Your big buildings are responsible for 1% of your building stock, so almost nothing, 555 buildings. And they're responsible for 37% of the total emissions. So from a policy perspective, you think, okay, that's, 500 buildings, that if we could touch those 500 buildings, how many owners do we think are, own those 500 buildings in the city? Maybe 100, maybe. If we can touch those, huge immediate impact on emissions. But here's the flip side of it, right? That means 99% of the building stock is responsible for 63% of total emissions. And I went past it, I can go back. 99% of the building stock is almost 62,000 buildings in the city. That is a lot of buildings, and they are all different. Unlike the big buildings, which have a lot of commonalities amongst them, all of these buildings are different. A lot of them are single family. I think there's about 55,000 single family buildings in the city. And so that is a huge focus of this, it was of the Zero Cities project and of upcoming work. So let's look at this framework then. If we have some of this data, let's look at the decarbonization framework and start figuring out, okay, how do we make policy? So there's a few questions that we start asking. The first is, what buildings are going to be affected? And one of the segmentations we just looked at already was that big buildings, small buildings one. But there may be other important segmentations, and even within those 555 big buildings, say, they're owner-occupied versus rented buildings might have very different policy implications if they're going to have different needs. And then the second key question to ask is, how are these buildings going to be decarbonized? Like, literally, how is that going to happen? And from a policy perspective, there's really two approaches. You can take a prescriptive approach, and any of you who are familiar with building and energy codes, this makes a lot of sense to you, but basically a prescriptive approach is a checkbox approach, where a policy can say, okay, buildings, you have to insulate your attics, make sure you don't have single pane windows, and use heat pumps instead of gas boilers. That would be a checkbox approach. Or there's the performance-based approach, where policy or a program doesn't say what you have to do, they just say where you have to get. And typically people are looking at energy policy or energy targets, but we strongly recommend looking at emissions targets, because that's really what's going to drive the change. A building is always going to consume energy, right? The question, efficiency is important, but from a carbon perspective, the question isn't so much how much energy the building is consuming, it's what kind of energy the building is consuming. And so a carbon target will help address that, the kind of clean energy versus dirty energy question. And then the last is when, and this one is really critical. When are these upgrades going to be required? And the two choices we really have here are to align with existing building intervention points, not existing buildings, but intervention points that are existing already in the life of the building, or have date certain policies. And I'll talk about a little bit of both. So why intervention points? Why are we talking about this? Intervention points are things actually that we're all very familiar with. Planned capital improvement cycles, something you typically find in big buildings, not small buildings. And then point of sale, point of lease, point of renovation, equipment replacement, times in a building's life where there's already naturally going to be some sort of intervention and upgrade happening to the building. And that could include life safety and resiliency upgrades as well. And the benefits of aligning with intervention points are many, but they include the opportunity to reduce upfront costs, increases financing options. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. This one is critical. Reduces disruption to occupants, no-brainer, but important. And finally, another really critical one, they have the opportunity to establish and ensure a long-term job market for these upgrades and guaranteed economic growth within the city. And again, I'll talk about a little bit more how that applies in a second. That was just really high level, so just a quick note that there's a lot more information on intervention points, but also on this entire framework on achievingzero.org, which again is the framework that came out of Zero Cities and came out of the work that Grand Rapids really led. So let's use some examples to go through that framework and talk about how this might be applied. So first, let's talk about big buildings. Again, still basing it on that high-level segmentation. These are the critical elements of the big building stock that we consider when looking at policy. The first we already talked about. We know it's just a small number of buildings. We know that they typically have a capital budget. I don't want to say, of course, that every single big building has a capital budget, but many, many do. And we know that there are really significant system variations. And by that, I mean different HVAC equipment and that kind of thing, because, I mean, a hospital is going to look really different from a library. It's going to look really different from an office building or from this ballroom. And that has policy implications. So, again, what's that what? In this case, we're already talking about big buildings, but does there need to be more segmentation? Is multifamily going to require different financial support? Is it going to require different kind of prescriptive or performance upgrades than an office building? Or, oh, and this one isn't on here, are there some buildings that need to be exempt? For example, heat pump technology is very, very widely applicable, but there are some building types where it's still really hard to fully electrify a building. So in some cases, some buildings might need to be exempt. And then the how, so are we talking about prescriptive or performance upgrades here? Our strong recommendation for the big building stock is that performance-based targets and upgrades are part of the policy. And that's partly because of the significant system variations. It'd be really hard for policymakers to be able to make a checkbox list of every upgrade that needs to occur that would be applicable to all the very unique types of buildings. So performance-based targets, again, say you have to achieve a 50% reduction in GHG emissions by a certain year, gives building owners a lot more choice and a lot more flexibility in how they approach that. And it might also be really important to include prescriptive-based targets as well for owners that want it to be a little bit less complicated. And then for big buildings, we really recommend date-certain requirements for similar reasons. And by date-certain requirements, I mean something like 50% reduction by 2030, 100% reduction by 2040. Again, that just allows building owners time, it allows them flexibility, it allows them to decide when they want to implement the upgrades, and it allows them to align not only with planned capital improvements, but with capital budgets. Oh, well, there's it. Sorry. And so probably the most well-known example of this is Local Law 97 in New York. Local Law 97 is an existing building decarbonization, energy and decarbonization policy that only applies to the big buildings. Right now, it's buildings over 25,000 square feet, and it's pretty straightforward. It's a phased, date-certain approach to reductions where they say you have to achieve this much greenhouse gas reduction by X date, this much by Y date. You can see right now that they're targeting 80% reduction total. I anticipate this changing to targeting 100% reduction. It could also change to include more buildings, but it's a very straightforward example of a policy that exactly meets that framework and that was passed, with support. And then small buildings. Again, this is really where the rubber meets the road. This is the big challenge. So what are some of the characteristics of small buildings that we consider? First of all, we already talked about this one, right? Hundreds to thousands of buildings, in some cities, hundreds of thousands of buildings. So it's a massive amount of buildings that need to be touched in a very short period of time. And the second piece, and again, touched on this, but this cannot be overstated. The upfront costs are, not only are they critical, they're prohibitive where they are for the majority of people. It is even, I don't know, you have to be very, very wealthy to be able to electrify your single family home right now, unfortunately, especially, and fully decarbonize it. But a benefit to this segment of the building stock, especially if we're talking about single family residential, is that these buildings are very similar across the board. They all have comparable types of equipment, heating them, fireplaces, stoves, et cetera, et cetera. And so we'll talk about it, but that allows opportunities for prescriptive policies to be put in place. So again, small buildings, sure, but do policies need to be segmented to be even more specific and make sure different conditions are being met? The first critical one is typically owner versus renter occupied. And when it's owner occupied, there is not what we call the split incentive, where an owner might pay for building upgrades that then the tenant reaps the benefits of on their utility bills. So it's a lot simpler sometimes for an owner occupied building to see an ROI and feel value in doing this kind of thing, whereas renter occupied requires a lot more nuance. It requires making sure that tenants are not penalized for upgrades that owners have put in place. And then how? In this case, our recommendation is pretty much the opposite of big buildings. When we said for big buildings, we recommend performance-based requirements so that owners have all the flexibility. They can decide what they want to do and when, as long as they meet the goal. For small buildings, there are a lot of reasons that is not a positive. One of the downsides of performance-based requirements is that they require a pre- and post-project audit. Someone to come in and say, here's your current situation, here's what you'll need to do to achieve your targets, and then go back in once the project is done and give a thumbs up or thumbs down on if you did that. That costs money and takes time, and if upfront costs are already a barrier, adding more costs to this is not going to be a very good, solution to the problem. So prescriptive upgrades, which are much more feasible because this building stock is very similar. We know, gas boilers and gas stoves and fireplaces and maybe a gas dryer. Like, we know what the equipment that most people have in their houses are. We can just take that checkbox approach, tell building owners that this is all you need to do. You don't need to have an auditor come in to tell you what to do. You don't need to have an auditor come in to verify that it was done correctly. It saves a lot of time and money there. And it makes it a lot easier to implement too. There's not any decision making that's required on the part of owners. And then finally, this is the when piece, and this is where the intervention point piece becomes really critical. So we recommend aligning with any of these intervention points. Each city is going to be different in terms of which intervention points are most appropriate, and maybe even different subsectors, but I'll quickly talk about some of the benefits of a few. So if a policy is aligned with a point of equipment replacement intervention point, kind of complicated, but what that really means is that the policy would say, when your existing gas appliance dies, you need to replace it with an electric appliance, a heat pump appliance. And the implications of that are that you're not pulling out equipment that still has useful life to replace it with new equipment, and then the cost consideration becomes a little bit less about the total cost of replacement and more about the incremental cost difference. Now, that's not to diminish the fact that it's still expensive to replace your equipment regardless of if it's at its end of its useful life or not. But in terms of kind of total cost, this is often the cheapest way of going about it. Again, still requires a lot of financial support. Point of sale, on the flip side, is one that the city of Cambridge is exploring and a few other cities are exploring. This is one of those times where that aligning with intervention points increases financing options really comes into play. There are innovative financing models being looked at right now where upgrade costs can be bundled with a mortgage. And the implication of that is that those costs are amortized over 30 years typically, and energy upgrades, not just efficiency, but electrification, are big drivers in reducing utility costs. I didn't talk about that, but I think it's worth actually taking a minute to talk about. Electrification in and of itself is an energy efficiency measure. Heat pumps are at least 300% more efficient than gas furnaces. Don't really know how. It's kind of magic. Like, if you put in 1 unit of power, you get 3 units of heat or cool out of it. If somebody can explain to me that magic, that's really cool. But the point is that when you electrify, even if you don't implement other energy efficiency measures, you're already reducing your energy demand by up to 300%, if not more. So when these upgrade requirements can be, if they could be bundled with a mortgage or with a renovation loan financing, you're almost always going to be reaping monthly savings because of that efficiency. And so, yes, these loans, if that's what we're talking about, to finance these upgrades have to be paid back, but typically the monthly cost of paying back those loans can be lower than the previous utility bills, so it's a saving across the board. And this is exactly what happened in Ithaca. And I'm going to end by talking about this policy example because this, in my opinion, is one of the most exciting things that has happened in the country, in the decarbonization world, in a long time. So Ithaca, New York, within the past few months, was the very first city in the country to pass a comprehensive existing building decarbonization policy. And I've been waiting and waiting for this to happen. I didn't know it was going to be Ithaca. They kind of surprised all of us, but they did it, and they did it by this. And I'll let you read the quote, but it's essentially saying that they did not look at this as a climate issue. They did not look at this as a technology issue. They looked at this as a financing issue. And they figured out creative financing. And again, I apologize for the long quotes, but I feel like this is really important. What their sustainability director is saying here and what they have achieved is that they were able to create financing mechanisms to guarantee zero upfront costs for any building owner and guaranteed monthly savings while paying back that loan. What's not to like, right? And the way they did this is pretty cool. For a long time, for years and years, people have been trying to figure out how to work with conventional financing mechanisms like PACE or on-bill financing, which are heavily dependent on utilities and on regulation. In a lot of states, where I'm from in Washington State, and also I'm aware of here, you are not even allowed to have PACE for residential buildings. And if you all aren't familiar with PACE, it's simply a financing model to allow overcoming the upfront cost barrier and then paying it back on your property tax assessment. It's legally not allowed for residential buildings. Utilities are the ones who provide on-bill financing. If they choose not to allow on-bill financing, again, to support this kind of thing, what are you gonna do? And so for a long time, people have just been running into this wall of being like, we don't have any options here. And so Ithaca was like, okay, we're gonna do something totally different. And so they worked with two private partners, Altruis and Block Power. They are private companies who have, this is all pretty new, so I'll give you my best understanding of it. More information will come out. They have private money from pension funds in a pot. And the Altruis people that I've talked to, for example, I believe they said they have $600 million sitting in a pot. And their entire goal with that money is to give it to cities to help buildings finance upgrades. And they pay the full upfront cost. They either charge zero interest or a small interest rate. And what they guarantee is that the monthly payments will not exceed previous utility costs. And so Altruis is their commercial partner. Block Power is their residential partner. And they, in addition to support that, they have a climate fund that they're working on. I know Grand Rapids is working on developing a climate fund too, potentially. But the point is that because there's all this private money and this really innovative financing mechanism that the Altruis guy told me there are like 2-3 companies in the country doing it right now, and he just expects that to boom, they were able to pass a policy that until this point seemed basically impossible to pass. And I will leave it by saying the last thing that the guy from Altruis that I talked to told me is that when they did this with Ithaca, Block Power, Ithaca, and Altruis, all of them did this through the lens of wanting this to be as scalable as possible to every other city in the country. So they're basically just sitting right there right now. Only the one company with $600 billion, not sure even how much Block Power has, waiting for cities to raise their hand and say, hey, we want to do this. So, yeah. Yep, and that's where I'll end it with really the beginning, the next beginning, right? Sherry already talked about E.H.Zero. E.H.Zero is the continuation of Zero Cities in Grand Rapids. It's an equity-focused approach to policy making. And again, in my opinion, a large part of the equity question is making sure not only are those upfront cost barriers overcome, but monthly energy cost burden is significantly reduced. And you all are continuing to lead. Incredibly well-funded project that I get to continue being a part of, and I'm just really excited for you all here. And that's it. Although I'm happy to take questions.